Chapter 9. Waters bounded, raged, and roared, a sudden warning to be ignored. Upon the rooftops sit and wait for whirling, swirling, watery fate. Old Niff hobbled her way through thick sludge and slop, down the heaving streets and crowded firelit alleyways of Scruffyness. She pushed her way through the scrums of Scruffs and shooed away the scrufflings, who tugged at her tattered wool coat. Twirling her cane above her head, she cleared a path down the snaking alleys, which led out onto the Great Squidge. Gibgob stood on Munch's head, waving her lit torch around. Munch and Tin Can were trying their best to avoid the swooping flame. Niff waddled over to the large, central mound of trash, sludge, and hair. "Stop!" she croaked as loud as she could, but her voice was lost in the cheers, jeers, and howls of the gathered crowds of scurrying Scruffs, who carpeted the Great Squidge. Niff shot a gurning scowl towards them, hitching up her coat as she barged through the crowd and headed up the central mound. She scaled the large pile of filth, scrambling through the sticky slop and slime until she was stopped by the large, muck-encrusted foot of Munch. It rested atop her head, crushing her hat. "Oi!" Niff grunted as she was squashed down by the hefty paw. She reached up and grabbed the huge appendage with both of her paws, gurning her gums as she struggled to turn the foot. The tower of Munch and Gibgob began to sway, as Munch was finally thrown off balance. He toppled, and Gibgob followed, tumbling over onto Niff, who briefly regretted her actions before the tower of Scruffs buried her in a heavy, sweaty pile of fur. After some time the laughter from the crowd began to quieten down. Gibgob lifted Munch's huge arm off her body and raised her head from his stinking armpit. She tried to speak, but retched, then lurched forward, coughing up a huge ball of Munch's fur. As the large ball rolled away down the slop pile, she looked out over the crowd, puffed up her chest, and barked loudly. "What are you laughing at?" The crowd fell silent. Those still sniggering had to be nudged or gagged by others. Niff crawled out from under Munch's huge body. She was disorientated and dazed. "You'd better have a good explanation for this, you senile old scruff!" shouted Gibgob accusingly. Niff shook herself back to her senses. Her matted grey fur stood on end, and she resembled a ball of grey yarn. Through her panting breath she wheezed. "What?" "What?" asked the scowling Gibgob. Munch shuffled himself upright and into a sitting position, then looked around. "What?" he replied in a state of confusion. "Water!" Niff finally managed to say. Gibgob's beak pursed up. Her bushy eyebrows frowned as she tried to understand. "What water?" she quizzed Niff, who leant on her cane as she rose, unsteadily but determined. She began to flail her arms wildly in the air, pointing excitedly towards the river. "The water has risen! The river has swelled!" continued Niff, as she began to circle the large trash mound's summit, addressing the huge crowd of misbehaving and squabbling Scruffs below. "Tree magic!" she began to wail, making motions of rising water with her paws and whooshing watery sounds from her beak. She danced around the mound like a Scruff possessed, telling tales of walking trees, the dam they had made across the river, and of the bathtub, which they carried within a cage of branches. Once she had finished her story, there was a brief silence. Every Scruff who stood on the Great Squidge had been listening intently to Niff. A roaring laugh broke the silence. Gibgob wobbled back and forth as she chuckled at Niff's story. This made the crowd nervous. No Scruff could remember ever having seen her laugh before. They all inched away from her, anticipating that something bad was about to happen. Gibgob's bellowing belly laugh echoed around the great squidge. After some considerable amount of time, she stopped laughing, wiped the tears from her eyes, and said, "You old Scruffs! All soft in the head, I say." Niff darted her gaze around the great squidge. On each of the smaller mounds of slop and in the valleys between, tightly huddled Scruffs cursed and mocked her. They would never listen, being either too ignorant or too scared of Gibgob. Niff calmly crouched down and hitched up her coat, hunching over as she slid and hopped down the gigantic pile of crud. She slowly hobbled her way through the great squidge, pushing through the crowds, who continued to mock and taunt her. Once she had reached the edge of the large town square, she stopped, looked up at the irregular thatched roofs before her, and started to climb. She scrambled up the clumps of itch-skitch wool and mud, clawing her way to the top. When she reached the apex of the roof, she turned around and plopped her hefty behind down upon the thatch. There were Scruffs lining every crooked rooftop surrounding the great squidge. Those surrounding Niff grew uneasy as a large, sinister smile began to slowly stretch across her face. Her brow lowered to meet her beak, and formed a positively menacing expression. She sat and got comfortable, then waited for the deluge to arrive.